Just yesterday, a colleague sent me a recent essay from Foreign Affairs. It was one of those deeply analytical, polished pieces, the kind written by the very architects of the global financial system. As I read through it, I couldn't shake the specific image. A doctor conducting a postmortem on a patient whose diet he had personally designed. The author was lamenting the fragmentation of globalization, mourning the end of an integrated world as if it were a sudden, shared tragedy for us all. But as I sat there, the ivory tower logic started to feel incredibly heavy. You see, for the people I talked to across this continent, that golden era of globalization didn't look like a success story. It looked like a structural trap. We were the silent suppliers, the ones providing the raw cobalt and the primary commodities for a machine we didn't design and certainly didn't control. We've spent decades as price takers, watching from the sidelines as our economic fates were decided in rooms we weren't invited to. Then I hit a passage that stopped me cold. It argued that the development path for low-income countries is effectively being foreclosed. It's a chilling thought. Just as Africa is finally beginning its ascent, launching the most ambitious free trade area in history, the advanced economies are reaching down and pulling up the ladder they used to climb to the top. When the U.S. enacts Made in America laws or the EU erects green borders, they aren't just protecting their own, they're changing the rules of the game mid-play. It left me wondering, what happens to a continent that was already on the margins when the center begins to crumble? When a manufacturer in Uganda faces higher shipping costs because of a conflict in the Red Sea they had no part in, or when a Tanzanian exporter sees their margins evaporate because of a trade war between Washington and Beijing, the fragmentation of the world isn't an academic theory, it's an existential threat. The world is stopping its integration, but for Africa, stopping isn't an option. The question is, can we build our own ladder before the old one disappears entirely?
Yeah, that structural shift toward true production sovereignty, it is the direct answer to that foreclosed development path you're talking about. Because you are looking at the forced, really abrupt termination of a deeply entrenched, highly unequal economic paradigm.
It is forced, yeah.
Exactly. Okay. And the continent is basically executing this rapid dual-pronged strategy now. So on one side, you have this defensive shielding against external volatility, and on the other, an offensive recalibration of industrial output.
A total recalibration.
Right. And to really understand this transition, you have to look closely at the specific mechanics of the African Continental Free Trade Area, or the AfCFTA, because that is the architectural framework for building these resilient internal markets.
It is the foundation.
And concurrently, you have to track the deployment of these hyper-aggressive industrial policies and, the integration of regional infrastructure. Because these are not, they're isolated initiatives. They're synchronized mechanisms engineered to transform the continent from a fragmented supplier of raw materials into a sovereign architect of finished goods.
So let us really dig into the geopolitical catalyst driving that synchronized shift, because the global trade environment right now is basically defined by this hydra of severe supply chain disruption.
Absolutely. It is a hydra.
You have extreme weather events on one hand, and then the explicit weaponization of national trade policies on the other. And a definitive inflection point really happened in April 2025.
Right, the U.S. policy shift.
Exactly. When the United States enacted those sweeping America First policies, that framework established a universal 10% minimum tariff across all international trading partners.
Just a blanket 10%.
A blanket 10%, but the mathematical impact on specific African imports was just disproportionately severe. Look at the South African automotive sector.
Yeah, that is the prime example.
It is a highly developed manufacturing base, right? They export finished vehicles, and suddenly they face targeted tariff spikes reaching up to 30%.
30%. You really have to consider the microeconomic reality of a 30% tariff on a highly complex manufactured good like an automobile.
It is devastating.
It completely breaks the model. The automotive industry operates on exceptionally tight, razor-thin margins, and it relies on these globally synchronized supply chains.
Right, every cent matters.
Exactly. So when a 30% tariff is slapped on at the port of entry, it does not just reduce profits, it entirely obliterates the mathematical viability of the export.
The math just stops working.
The landed cost of the vehicle suddenly exceeds the consumer price threshold in the American market. And that forces an immediate hard stop to production lines in South Africa that, were historically calibrated specifically for U.S. consumers.
And as if that was not enough of a shock, that dynamic was compounded by a massive structural collapse just a few months later.
September
2025. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, expired.
The bedrock of the whole system just gone.
Literally the bedrock.
Yeah.
For a quarter of a century, AGOA functioned by providing non-reciprocal duty-free access to the U.S. market for thousands of products from sub-Saharan Africa. And the expiration of that act instantly stripped away decades of preferential treatment. It presented African exporters with this stark binary choice.
Yeah.
Either absorb these massive new levies and operate at a catastrophic loss, or rapidly re-engineer your entire distribution network to find entirely new markets.
And, the regulatory barriers multiplying across the Atlantic, they extend way beyond simple tariffs. Look at the European Union.
Oh, the carbon mechanism.
The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, which took full effect in January 2026. This introduced a fundamentally different type of structural blockade.
Because it is tied to emissions.
Exactly. CBAM functions by forcing importers of carbon-intensive goods to mathematically calculate and financially pay for the embedded emissions generated during the entire production process. In theory, sure. But for African manufacturers, who frequently rely on fossil fuel-heavy energy grids and diesel transport, not out of choice, mind you, but out of sheer infrastructural necessity, this mechanism acts as an insurmountable penalty.
It is essentially a green border.
Yeah. A highly sophisticated green border that effectively locks developing industries out of the European market entirely. The functional mechanics of CBAM are deeply restrictive. The European framework demands this incredibly precise accounting of the carbon output required to produce industrial staples.
Steel and aluminum.
Right, fertilizer, too. And then it applies a financial penalty equivalent to the European carbon price. The goal is to ensure these imports do not undercut European domestic goods that are produced under heavily subsidized, stricter environmental regulations.
But the macroeconomic reality is totally different.
Yeah, for an African exporter, it is a sudden, crippling loss of international competitiveness. I mean, you have a continent that contributes the lowest cumulative percentage of global carbon emissions, paradoxically being penalized for lacking the capital required to immediately leapfrog into green industrial technology.
It is wild when you think about it.
It jeopardizes access to a market that historically absorbed roughly 1/3 of the continent's external trade.
But then, conversely, you have to look at the trade dynamic with China, because it presents a diametrically opposed structural reality.
It is a totally different paradigm.
Right. China has decisively overtaken the United States as Africa's paramount trading partner, and the architecture of this relationship is actively accelerating African industrial integration.
Actively pushing it forward.
Yeah. For instance, China expanded its duty-free treatment for least developed countries to encompass 95% of all tariff lines.
Which is massive.
It is huge. And simultaneously, Chinese demand for African commodities operates at just an unprecedented scale. This sustained, high-volume commodity demand serves as this vital macroeconomic engine. It directly capitalizes African sovereign budgets while driving immense, sustained technology transfers into domestic industrial sectors.
But tech transfer is key.
Exactly. China approaches the continent as an indispensable strategic partner. They are establishing a framework built for long-term integration and physical development, entirely devoid of the protectionist barriers that are currently defining Western trade policy.
Because that expansion of duty-free access to 95% of tariff lines by China, it fundamentally rewrites the rules of engagement. I mean, historically, international trade regimes utilize tariff escalation.
Where the raw stuff is free, but the processed stuff gets taxed.
Exactly. It is a practice where raw materials faced zero tariffs, but progressively higher tariffs were applied at every single stage of value addition. So it effectively punished any attempt by African nations to process their own resources.
It kept them as raw material suppliers.
Yes. The Chinese framework eliminates that penalty entirely. It provides the specific structural advantage necessary for African nations to export semi-processed or fully manufactured goods directly into the world's largest and most dynamic consumer market.
And the mechanics of the technology transfer are really systematic too, aren't they?
Oh, highly systematic. When Chinese state and private capital partners with African industrial initiatives, it deploys world-class manufacturing methodologies, heavy machinery, and infrastructure blueprints directly onto the continent.
It is not just sending a check.
No, it is not passive investment at all. It is the active construction of physical productive capacity, which drastically compresses the timeline required for comprehensive African industrialization.
Right. So when analyzing the sudden imposition of U.S. tariffs, the expiration of AGOA, and the activation of the EU's carbon borders, the immediate perception is one of systemic hostility.
Of course, it feels like an attack.
But consider the analogy of a farmer who has relied for decades on unpredictable external weather patterns to grow a crop. A sudden, permanent shift in the climate that brings devastating frost does not merely destroy the harvest. It forces the farmer to stop relying on the open sky entirely and build a resilient, temperature-controlled, self-sustaining greenhouse. The external global trade environment has become inherently hostile and fragmented. However, that very hostility is the exact catalyst forcing the construction of a controlled, sovereign internal system.
You are building the greenhouse.
Exactly. The collapse of these asymmetric donor-recipient trade deals represents a forced evolution toward absolute self-reliance.
And that forced evolution defines the overarching policy shift currently recognized across African capitals as the Accru-Reset.
The Accru-Reset. Let us get into that.
It is a profound structural pivot in economic philosophy. For the preceding half-century, African macroeconomic policy was largely defined by a defensive posture of compliance.
Right, always trying to meet someone else's rules.
Precisely. Economies were meticulously engineered to comply with the stringent demands of foreign aid donors, or the structural adjustment mandates of the World Bank, or the specific, narrow regulations of asymmetric trade pacts. The primary objective was just maintaining access to external capital in external markets, regardless of the internal developmental cost.
Whatever the cost at home, just keep the donors happy.
But the Accru-Reset definitively abandons this compliance posture. It is replaced by an offensive, uncompromising stance demanding production sovereignty.
Production sovereignty.
Right. The underlying economic theorem here is absolute. Sovereignty is an illusion if a nation must systematically import its basic finished goods while continually hemorrhaging its raw wealth to foreign processors.
You cannot be sovereign if you cannot make anything. And to really comprehend the true mechanics of this transition toward production sovereignty, you have to examine the granular microeconomic reality at the ground level.
You have to see what it actually looks like.
Right. So enter a humid, unair-conditioned workshop situated in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Accra.
Okay.
You find a man named Kofi. He is running his calloused thumb over the edge of a temperamental, secondhand stainless steel cocoa roaster. The air inside the workshop is incredibly thick, heavy with the sharp, bitter smell of burnt cocoa husks and physical sweat.
That is a very real picture.
It is the reality. For generations, his family operated at the very bottom of the global value chain. They grew raw cocoa beans, dried them in the sun, and watched them disappear into massive burlap sacks bound for the ports of Antwerp or Amsterdam.
Right, to be processed in Europe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they would subsequently purchase finished chocolate products at retail prices, perfectly dictated by a European market they had zero capacity to influence.
It's a classic extractive trap.
So Kofi is actively attempting to sever this cycle by roasting and processing the beans himself. But his financial vulnerability is severe. He operates in a highly overleveraged state. The local commercial bank has locked him into predatory interest rates, which is a direct reflection of the continent's structural lack of affordable industrial capital.
It's almost impossible to get cheap capital for manufacturing.
Yeah. And adding to this pressure, he recently received a formal rejection letter from a European distributor. The letter cited standardization inconsistencies.
Yes, standardization inconsistencies.
Right. It is a heavily bureaucratic, highly polished method of utilizing arbitrary quality metrics to maintain the historical barrier against African value addition.
That environment in his workshop illustrates the precise systemic friction of the historical economic trap. I mean, Kofi is attempting to execute a fundamental economic maneuver. He wants to capture the value multiplier that exists in the space between a raw agricultural commodity and a manufactured consumer good.
He wants that margin.
Exactly. But the legacy global system is designed to prevent this exact maneuver. He faces exorbitant capital costs that make machine maintenance nearly impossible, technological deficits regarding packaging and preservation, and the deployment of weaponized international standards that function as invisible tariffs.
Invisible tariffs, yeah.
Because that European rejection based on standardization is the classic mechanism used to protect foreign processors from emerging domestic competition.
But the critical pivot occurs precisely at the moment of that European rejection. Instead of capitulating to the external barrier, Kofi is actively shifting his distribution strategy toward Lagos.
He is looking inward.
Exactly. Under the rapidly dividing logistical framework of the AfCFTA, the specific regional tariffs that once made selling his roasted cocoa across the border to a neighboring West African country far more expensive than shipping it across the Atlantic Ocean to Switzerland are being systematically dismantled.
Which is a huge shift.
It is massive. This physical workshop, characterized by the deafening noise of the roaster and the bitter smell of the husks, is the actual physical frontline of continental industrialization. Kofi's deliberate pivot toward the Nigerian market represents the real-time dismantling of the colonial trade architecture.
And, Kofi's strategic pivot is not occurring in a vacuum. It is being heavily incentivized and protected by a sweeping return to sharp, aggressive industrial policies enacted at the state level across the continent.
States are stepping in.
African governments have definitively discarded the theoretical free market orthodoxies that historically favored entrenched global monopolies. They are currently engineering highly specific tax frameworks and regulatory environments designed to financially punish reliance on foreign imports.
And actively reward local manufacturing.
Actively, aggressively rewarding local manufacturing capacity.
And the structural aggression of these new policies is profound. Analyze the Tax Reform Act signed into law in Nigeria in mid-2025.
That was a huge piece of legislation.
It operates as a masterclass in targeted industrial engineering. The legislation entirely exempts small manufacturing enterprises from the burden of corporate income tax.
Zero corporate tax.
Zero. Furthermore, the state provides a direct 5% tax credit specifically earmarked for capital expenditure on heavy machinery and industrial equipment. This policy physically alters the economic incentives within the nation. The government is structurally rewarding the deployment of physical productive capacity, the actual construction of factories, the installation of assembly lines,
rather than just rewarding the passive accumulation and retail sale of imported foreign inventory.
Exactly.
And you see a similarly precise bureaucratic dismantling occurring in Egypt through the execution of Law Number 6 and the implementation of the Golden License.
A golden license.
Well, it is a targeted mechanism engineered to shatter institutional friction. Historically, an industrialist attempting to establish a manufacturing plant in Egypt was forced to navigate this Byzantine labyrinth of competing ministries, municipal authorities, and environmental boards, securing dozens of individual sequential approvals.
Just a nightmare of red tape.
A total nightmare. This bureaucratic density could delay actual production timelines by multiple years, totally destroying the velocity of invested capital.
Right.
The Golden License bypasses this entire architecture. It grants strategic industrial projects a single, consolidated operational approval directly from the cabinet level. So it allows factories to move from architectural blueprints to active production lines in a fraction of the historical time.
And then in East Africa, the strategy centers on aggressive mandated import substitution. The Ethiopian government has fundamentally restructured access to its massive state-built industrial parks. These zones, which were historically the exclusive protected domain of foreign export-oriented firms, have been forcibly opened to local Ethiopian manufacturing companies.
Which totally changes who benefits from that infrastructure.
The state has issued a highly specific policy objective: systematically replace 96 explicitly categorized imported goods with domestically manufactured alternatives within a rigid 3-year operational window.
3 years is a very tight window for that kind of transition.
It is aggressive. Meanwhile, Kenya is executing the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, universally referred to as BETA. The foundational logistical pillar of BETA is the construction of county aggregation and industrial parks.
The CAIPs.
Right, the CAIPs. And the genius of this policy is spatial. They are physically building the industrial processing capacity directly adjacent to the rural farm gate.
Right there where the crop is grown.
Exactly. This eliminates the massive post-harvest losses caused by transporting raw, perishable agricultural produce across long distances on inadequate rural roads. It forces the value addition to occur at the absolute source of the commodity.
And moving to the hard commodity sector, look at the Republic of Guinea. They are exercising unprecedented sovereign leverage over their bauxite reserves.
Right, and bauxite is crucial for aluminum.
Exactly. Guinea controls approximately 25% of the total global supply of bauxite. Now, the Guinean government has implemented strict, non-negotiable legal timetables requiring foreign mining conglomerates to construct local alumina refineries directly on Guinean soil.
So they cannot just dig it up and leave anymore.
No. The state has eliminated all strategic ambiguity on this. Failure to comply with the refinery construction schedule triggers severe, escalating financial penalties.
And it culminates in what?
It culminates in the outright revocation and cancellation of the extraction licenses. Yeah. The historical era of extracting raw earth and exporting it to foreign refineries without transferring the physical processing infrastructure to the host nation has been abruptly and legally terminated.
It is a totally new era, but it is crucial to understand that these industrial policies require exact and sometimes very severe macroeconomic sacrifices.
Yeah.
Analyze Rwanda's highly aggressive 2024-25 national budget. The Rwandan government executed a dual tariff maneuver. They completely zeroed out all import duties on raw materials and specialized machinery destined for domestic textile manufacturing.
Right, to stimulate the local industry.
Exactly. But simultaneously, they instituted a massive tariff spike on the importation of secondhand clothes. The analogy here is absolute. You are deliberately burning the lifeboats to force the crew to navigate the ship.
It is a hardcore commitment.
The government is engineering a massive financial incentive to produce garments domestically. However, the immediate real-world trade-off is exceptionally brutal for low-income consumers who mathematically rely on the affordability of secondhand clothing.
Because the local alternatives aren't cheap enough yet.
Right. Furthermore, this policy instantly devastates the vast informal job market that relies entirely on sorting, distributing, and retailing those imported garments.
Yeah, the severity of that trade-off is undeniable. But it is dictated by an impending demographic reality that simply does not permit alternative strategy.
And numbers are staggering.
Data is immutable. The African continent will house 1 billion individuals under the age of 25 by the year 2050.
1 billion.
1 billion under 25. The historical economic model relying on the importation of cheap, secondhand foreign goods to satisfy consumer demand mathematically fails to generate the massive volume of formal, high-value, skill-building jobs required to sustain an exploding youth demographic.
You cannot build a middle class on selling secondhand clothes.
Exactly. The policy execution in Rwanda, which is being mirrored across the continent, demands an uncompromising focus on productive industrial growth. The short-term economic shock absorbed by the informal retail sector is the precisely calculated cost of establishing a sovereign, vertically integrated textile industry capable of employing millions of citizens in formal manufacturing roles. And
this relentless drive for physical production sovereignty is simultaneously mirrored and amplified in the digital realm. You have to examine the concept of data sovereignty. If African nations fail to construct and control their own digital infrastructure, they face the immediate threat of data colonialism.
Data colonialism.
Right. It is a highly sophisticated, modern extraction model where raw data, the most valuable commodity of the 21st century, flows continuously north to train and feed foreign algorithmic models.
Taking the raw resource again.
Exactly. And subsequently, the finished digital products, the optimized AI tools, and the targeted advertising flow back south to be sold to African consumers. It is the exact same extractive trap that defined the export of raw cobalt or unroasted cocoa beans, merely transposed into the architecture of server farms and fiber optic cables.
And data colonialism represents a profound existential threat to continental sovereignty, precisely because artificial intelligence and machine learning now dictate the future trajectory of industrial efficiency, agricultural optimization, and national security.
Everything runs on it.
Everything. If a sovereign state does not possess physical and legal control over its own data sets, it fundamentally cedes control over its future economic optimization.
Right.
Nations like Rwanda and Namibia are aggressively countering this dynamic by executing heavy state-backed investments in digital public infrastructure, or DPI.
Yeah.
They are actively engineering interoperable open-source data exchange platforms that reside strictly under sovereign legal control. And Nigeria is accelerating this paradigm even further by directing state capital into the foundational development of national large language models.
National LLMs.
Yes. By engineering sovereign LLMs, Nigeria guarantees that the artificial intelligence systems destined to govern its future civic institutions, healthcare networks, and financial grids are trained explicitly on localized data.
So the AI actually understands the local context.
Exactly. This ensures the AI inherently understands complex local linguistic nuances, cultural context, and operates completely independently of the opaque algorithms controlled by foreign technology monopolies.
And the necessity of this physical and digital production sovereignty brings the analysis directly back to the African Continental Free Trade Area. Because building immense localized manufacturing capacity is economically futile if you do not possess a resilient, highly integrated internal market capable of absorbing the manufactured output.
You need buyers.
You need a massive market, and the AfCFTA functions as the ultimate strategic buffer. It is a massive shield designed to absorb and deflect the shocks of global supply chain volatility. The agreement legally merges 54 distinct national economies into a single, unified market comprising 1.4 billion people, possessing a combined gross domestic product exceeding $3.4 trillion. The macroeconomic data confirms the efficacy of this integration. By the end of 2023, intra-African trade had demonstrably grown to 16.6% of total continental trade. Furthermore, looking at the forward trajectory, real GDP growth for the continent is rigorously projected at 4.1 to 4.4% going into 2026.
And, that metric of 16.6% for intra-African trade serves as a really critical baseline indicator.
Right.
While it currently registers lower than the heavily entrenched internal trade metrics observed within the European Union or the ASEAN bloc, the upward trajectory is sharp and decisive.
It is moving fast.
Very fast. And to physically accelerate this integration, the AfCFTA Secretariat engineered and deployed the Guided Trade Initiative, or the GTI. You have to understand the GTI not as just a policy document, but as the practical operational engine room of the entire free trade agreement.
It is where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly. Yeah. Deliberately bypasses prolonged theoretical tariff negotiations and actively facilitates real-time physical commercial shipments between sovereign states that have achieved the minimum legal requirements for preferential trade. The GTI has rapidly scaled its operational footprint, expanding to encompass 39 participating nations actively moving goods across borders under the new framework.
And examining the specific commercial successes executed under the GTI provides empirical proof that the continent can and is trading high-value, complex manufactured goods internally.
Real products.
Real products. Kenya, for instance, is utilizing the GTI framework to export locally manufactured deep-cycle industrial batteries and highly processed tea products, registering a verified volume growth of 45% in these specific sectors.
45% is huge.
It is. Rwanda is actively executing the cross-border trade of highly processed, packaged specialty coffee and refined agricultural products like chili paste. Zambia is strategically leveraging the initiative to transform the Libido corridor into a highly efficient central hub for the distribution of intermediate industrial goods and heavy mining equipment components.
And these specific physical transactions represent the actualization of the AfCFTA. When a Kenyan manufacturer exports a finished industrial battery to a buyer in a neighboring African nation, rather than the buyer importing that exact battery from a supplier in Asia or Europe, the macroeconomic impact is immediate.
The money stays home.
The financial capital remains circulating within the continental economy. The highly skilled manufacturing jobs required to assemble the battery remain within the continent. And most crucially, the entire supply chain is geographically insulated from maritime choke points, rendering it immune to disruptions in the Red Sea or volatile shipping lane insurance premiums.
However, acknowledging these successes requires confronting a massive operational hurdle that actively restricts the velocity of this integration. The paperwork paradox, technically defined in logistics as the policy-to-port gap.
Right, the policy-to-port gap.
Consider this exact analysis. You possess a state-of-the-art, hyper-fast, exquisitely engineered smartphone, but you are forced to operate it utilizing a decaying, overloaded 2G cellular network.
It is incredibly frustrating.
That is what it feels like. The high-level trade ministries, the heads of state, and the AfCFTA Secretariat in Accra are perfectly aligned on the legal protocols. But when a physical commercial truck actually arrives at a remote, dusty border post, the frontline customs officer is still dragging the entire logistical process into a standstill.
Because the systems aren't talking to each other.
Exactly. They are utilizing legacy operating systems, demanding physical manual stamping of triplicate documents, and adhering to outdated contradictory verification protocols. The overarching policy is built for the 21st century. The physical port operates on analog mechanics.
And that policy-to-port gap represents the single greatest point of friction, restricting the exponential growth of intra-African trade. High-level political alignment and ratified treaties do not automatically generate efficient border logistics.
You need the infrastructure behind it.
But the ultimate structural solution to this cross-border friction is not simply better custom software.
It is deeper than that.
Much deeper. It is deep, comprehensive financial integration. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, universally known as PPSS, provides the exact financial architecture required to dissolve this friction. To understand the revolutionary nature of PPSS, you really have to understand the historical baseline.
How it used to work.
Exactly. Historically, if a commercial buyer located in Nigeria wished to purchase a shipment of goods from a manufacturer in Kenya, the financial transaction could not be settled in either naira or shillings.
Which is crazy to think about.
The trade had to be executed utilizing a hard external currency, almost exclusively United States dollars or euros.
And the mechanics of that historical system were incredibly punitive. Because the transaction relied on external hard currency, the capital literally had to leave the African continent. The funds were electronically routed through foreign correspondent banks located in the financial centers of New York or London.
So they take their cut.
Exactly. This routing process incurred heavy processing fees from Western financial institutions, subjected the transaction to volatile currency exchange rate fluctuations, and introduced multi-day delays before the capital finally returned to the African continent to complete a transaction between two nations sharing the exact same landmass. It operated as an invisible, heavy, and constant tax levied on every single intra-African commercial exchange.
But PSSS fundamentally eliminates that extractive paradigm. The platform enables the Nigerian buyer to initiate the payment in naira and the Kenyan seller to receive the exact equivalent in Kenyan shillings instantly and securely.
Without it ever leaving the continent.
Exactly. The intricate process of clearing and settlement occurs entirely internally, utilizing a continental switch. This mechanism not only completely strips out the parasitic correspondent banking fees and the temporal delays, but it fundamentally severs the structural dependency on external hard currencies to facilitate internal economic growth.
It is a massive shift.
And underpinning this massive shift in financial architecture is the African Export-Import Bank, or AfRexim Bank. They are deploying trade finance liquidity at unprecedented historic levels. The institution disbursed $18.7 billion in targeted trade finance in 2024 and has established a hard, mathematically modeled target of reaching $40 billion in disbursements by 2026.
$40 billion.
$40 billion. This immense pool of accessible liquidity is the absolute lifeblood required to scale intra-African manufacturing capacity to meet continental demand.
The financial architecture is vital, absolutely. But you must recognize that financial liquidity must ultimately map onto the physical reality of moving heavy freight.
You still have to move the goods.
And to grasp the extreme friction of physical trade, project yourself into the daily reality of Elodie. She operates out of a dimly lit, high-pressure logistics and dispatch office in Kigali. Her workstation is dominated by screens filled with complex digital maps tracking convoys of heavy commercial trucks moving slowly along the central corridor.
That is a tough job.
Because Rwanda is landlocked, every single ton of imported raw material and every exported finished good carries a brutal, inescapable geography tax. Elodie's daily operational reality consists of fighting against structural infrastructural failures. She navigates inconsistent rail gauges across borders that force thousands of tons of cargo to be physically unloaded from one train and reloaded onto another.
The inefficiency is staggering.
She must constantly reroute convoys to avoid unpredictable geopolitical tremors that can freeze a primary transport artery overnight. At one point in the office, you watch a glitchy, buffering live stream of Mark Carney lecturing the developing world on the urgent necessity of adhering to Western climate disclosure metrics, and the cognitive dissonance is physically staggering.
Imagine.
How does a logistics manager prioritize Western ESG disclosure frameworks when a critical provincial bridge has just collapsed under the weight of a truck, entirely severing the primary supply route for the region? But Elodie's specific operational environment is shifting.
It is getting better.
Driven by intensive regional coordination, she is finally observing convoys moving seamlessly across national borders without being subjected to the excruciating process of being unloaded 5 separate times, simply to satisfy conflicting, redundant national paperwork. Her meticulous logistical tracking is the literal physical machinery moving the continent from a passive recipient of global shocks to an active, highly integrated participant in the global economy.
And Elodie's daily ground-level operational battles precisely quantify the profound macroeconomic cost of the continent's historic infrastructure deficit.
It has a real dollar amount.
The current data estimates this infrastructure shortage exacts a toll of between $130 to $170 billion annually in lost economic potential. Without the existence of consistent, standardized rail networks, paved arterial highways capable of handling heavy axle loads, and unified, digitized, one-stop border posts. The raw cost of physically moving a finished good from a manufacturing plant in Kigali to a consumer base in Mombasa completely destroys the product's price competitiveness against cheap Asian imports.
It just costs too much to move it.
Exactly. And this calculation is the precise reason the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, known as PDIA, is shifting its entire strategic deployment toward the integrated corridor approach.
Which is a huge shift in how they build things.
The integrated corridor approach represents a monumental shift in civil engineering philosophy. It mandates that states stop treating infrastructure as isolated, politically motivated national projects. You do not simply construct a two-lane road in a vacuum, you engineer a synchronized, multimodal logistical artery.
So everything connects.
Exactly. This artery seamlessly connects an inland mining zone directly to a specialized industrial processing park, and subsequently connects that park to a high-capacity deepwater port, utilizing unified, digitized customs protocols along the entire length of the route.
And the data backs this up, right?
The econometric panel data analyzing the catalytic multiplying role of these distinct infrastructure sectors reveals fascinating hierarchies. Information and Communication Technology, or ICT, demonstrates the absolute strongest multiplier effect on broad economic activity.
Over roads.
Over roads. The deployment of fiber optics and digital connectivity accelerates growth faster than any other sector. This is sequentially followed by heavy transport infrastructure, then the expansion of electrical grids, and finally, bulk water management systems.
It is fascinating that digital comes first.
The superior multiplier effect associated with ICT infrastructure demonstrates that in the modern economy, digital connectivity accelerates the velocity and efficiency of all other physical economic activities, from supply chain tracking to digital payments. The data further reveals that the East African Community, the EAC, currently operates as the flying geese block for the entire continent regarding the positive impacts of infrastructure deployment.
The flying geese paradox.
Yes, it illustrates how one advanced sector or region leads the structural transformation, pulling the others along in its slipstream. The EAC's aggressive, coordinated investments in integrated regional transport corridors and unified digital networks have yielded the highest measurable economic outcomes. It establishes a precise, mathematically proven blueprint for other regional economic communities across the continent to emulate and deploy.
You must recognize, however, that infrastructure in the 21st century is no longer defined strictly by physical steel, asphalt, and poured cement. Consider the monumental importance of the AfCFTA protocol on digital trade.
That protocol is essential.
Negotiating and ratifying this specific protocol is exactly like writing the invisible foundational traffic laws that are absolutely necessary before you can safely unleash a fleet of autonomous vehicles onto a newly paved physical highway.
You need the rules of the road.
You simply cannot maintain a highly functional, secure digital economy without rigorous, synchronized legal rules governing exactly how consumer data crosses sovereign borders, how digital corporate identities are cryptographically verified, and the specific legal jurisdictions under which cross-border e-commerce disputes are resolved.
And the Digital Trade Protocol supplies that exact regulatory convergence. It guarantees secure cross-border data flows and ensures deep system interoperability across varying national frameworks.
So a company in one country can easily operate in another.
This architecture allows a sophisticated e-commerce platform developed by engineers in Nairobi to seamlessly scale its operations and securely process data in Lagos without facing regulatory fragmentation.
And it creates these specialized zones, too.
Yes. This protocol has directly enabled the creation of specialized digital free zones. The Itana Digital Free Zone, currently operational in Nigeria, serves as the prime example of this environment. It is meticulously designed exclusively for technology startups and digital service providers.
So it is built for tech, not manufacturing.
Exactly. It offers a highly tailored regulatory environment, specialized corporate visa structures, and optimized tax incentives built explicitly for the velocity of the digital economy, rather than relying on legacy regulations originally designed to govern physical manufacturing plants.
Right. And all this complex infrastructure development, financial integration, and digital convergence leads directly to the ultimate economic mechanism, harnessing primary commodities to drive broad, extremely deep continental industrialization.
Which is the ultimate goal.
Historically, Africa was forcibly locked into the colonial development model. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the structural adjustment programs strictly mandated by Western financial institutions forced extreme, rapid market liberalization upon fragile African economies.
The SAPs just decimated local industry.
They did. These SAPs actively dismantled nascent infant industries by stripping away necessary tariff protections, completely removed state financial support from domestic manufacturing, and effectively forced widespread, catastrophic deindustrialization across the continent. This policy framework intentionally locked African economies back into the lowest value tier of raw material extraction.
And the sheer, unprecedented scale of the continent's raw material endowments makes this historical period of forced deindustrialization incredibly costly in terms of lost capital accumulation. I mean, look at the numbers.
They are massive.
Africa currently possesses 12% of the world's proven oil reserves, 42% of its gold deposits, between 80 and 90% of the global supply of critical industrial metals like chromium and platinum, and a staggering 60% of the Earth's remaining uncultivated arable land.
60%.
Remaining a mere exporter of these raw endowments systematically transfers all the wealth generation, all the complex job creation, and all the subsequent technological advancement directly to the foreign nations possessing the industrial capacity to process them.
And this mathematical reality necessitates the immediate, aggressive development of regional value chains. The overarching objective is transitioning from raw extraction to absolute manufacturing sovereignty.
You see this clearly in the auto sector.
Yes. Analyze the African Auto Pact currently being driven by South Africa. The strategic objective is not simply to assemble imported vehicle kits. It is to engineer a fully synchronized regional supply chain where the distinct components, the refined leather for seating, the complex electronics for navigation systems, the processed rubber for tires, are sourced and manufactured entirely from across the continent.
It is full integration.
Exactly. In the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, you see a fierce, coordinated effort to integrate directly into the highly lucrative global value chain for electric vehicles. These nations are no longer content to simply dig and export raw lithium ore. They are actively building the chemical processing capacity required to transform that raw lithium into high-value battery precursors.
And in agriculture, too.
In Zimbabwe, where agriculture accounts for 17% of the national GDP and 40% of total exports, the intense focus is on deep agro-processing. They are engineering the capacity to transform raw, perishable crops into high-value, shelf-stable, packaged food products specifically calibrated for the regional consumer market.
Executing this transition requires the complete intellectual abandonment of the academic concept known as the resource curse.
Oh, the resource curse.
The dominant historical narrative continually suggested that the possession of vast natural resources inherently corrupted national institutions, distorted currency values, and naturally stifled the development of complex manufacturing. The empirical reality is that physical resources are not a curse. They're simply dormant capital awaiting highly strategic application.
The resource curse is a complete myth. Commodities are not a curse. They operate exactly like a heavy-lift rocket booster. A rocket booster is inherently highly volatile, highly explosive, and extremely dangerous if the combustion is mismanaged or the trajectory is poorly directed.
But you need it to launch.
Exactly. But you must understand that it is the absolute only physical mechanism capable of generating the sheer, massive, sustained thrust required to break a low-income economy completely out of the gravitational pull of systemic poverty and propel it into stable economic orbit. You simply cannot achieve industrial liftoff without burning the massive fuel provided by your baseline commodity wealth.
And the successful application of that explosive thrust requires highly deliberate, meticulously targeted state action. The specific economic linkages strictly necessary for industrialization. The backward linkages connecting local domestic suppliers to massive mining equipment contracts, and the forward linkages connecting raw ore extraction to high-tech processing plants that manufacture complex industrial components do not magically or spontaneously generate through the application of pure free market forces.
They do not just happen on their own.
No. Left entirely unregulated multinational corporations will naturally and mathematically default to utilizing their already established, highly optimized global supply chains. Therefore, heavy state intervention is absolutely non-negotiable. Governments must legally mandate and rigorously enforce strict local content policies. Furthermore, they must aggressively deploy strategic matching grant programs to systematically upgrade the technical skills of the local workforce and enhance the technological capacity of domestic firms. This ensures local enterprises are not systematically and economically squeezed out of the value chain by highly capitalized multinational-led firms.
So the complex threads of this macroeconomic transformation are pulling tightly together. The physical integration of cross-border infrastructure corridors, the immediate liberation of regional capital through independent financial architecture like PNAP-PSS, and the deployment of razor-sharp, uncompromising state industrial policy represent a permanent, irreversible paradigm shift.
It is permanent.
You are witnessing the absolute end of the era of incrementalism.
The kind of incremental progress is mathematically insufficient for a continent currently facing both unprecedented explosive demographic expansion and navigating a rapidly fragmenting, highly volatile global geopolitical order.
It is just moving too fast.
The implementation of the AfCFTA, the ratification of the digital protocols, and the aggressive shift toward full production sovereignty combine to form a comprehensive offensive economic strategy. It functions as the exact architectural blueprint for a self-sustaining economic engine designed to utilize its own raw materials to explicitly supply its own massive continental demand.
True economic independence is not defined by lines drawn on a map, nor is it secured by the singing of national anthems. It is defined by the physical, digital, and sovereign capacity to process a single commodity, pulling it from the earth, refining it, manufacturing it into a highly complex good, and delivering it directly to the end consumer entirely on one's own terms, completely immune to the fragmentation, friction, and volatility of the outside world.